Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be introducing the book of Ecclesiastes. First of all, Ecclesiastes is part of a collection known as the Megillot. The term Megillot means the scrolls. The oath ending is the feminine plural. And it's speaking of five scrolls that are taken out and read traditionally at certain times throughout the Jewish religious year. For example, Song of Solomon is read at Passover. You say, I thought that at Passover they would be reading the book of Exodus and the story of the Passover. They do that, but they also read the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon. Ruth is read at Shabbaot, what we call the Feast of Pentecost, because it takes place around that time. Lamentations is read at the ninth of Av, which is the anniversary of the fall of Jerusalem. You say, which fall of Jerusalem? The one back in the Old Testament with 586 BC, or the one after the New Testament in the year 70 AD? And the answer is yes. It fell on the same day, but many, many hundreds of years apart. Esther is read at Purim. That actually makes sense because that's a book that tells how that feast and that festival came to be. Ecclesiastes, notice, is read at Sukkot. That is the Feast of Tabernacles, takes place in the fall. That feast where for a week our Jewish friends move out of their homes and they move into temporary dwellings. Now, sometimes you say, well, what happens if they're living up north and it's sort of cold? Well, they might move out of their home and into their living room and set up a temporary booth there. But they celebrate this time, a time when the Jewish people had no home of their own. They had no homes. They were out in the wilderness. But Ecclesiastes is going to talk about that time, not physically when they're out in the wilderness, but spiritually. And also that idea that where we live right now is just temporary. This is a temporary dwelling. And so all those things are going to come to account at the feast of, or in the book of Ecclesiastes. Let's start chapter 1, verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, when you say, notice David, king in Jerusalem, and the son of David, well, you know who that is. But he doesn't call himself by a name. Instead, he refers to himself as the preacher. Now, the term there, the kohelet, and the at ending I just said before, that's feminine plural. But this isn't the woman preacher. This is a man. How do I know that? Because he's the son of David, not the daughter of David. So even though it has a feminine ending, which is a little unusual, but that's explained, the term is from the root word kahal, which means to gather. So the person who has gathered people together, and I guess a preacher can, that works, I suppose. As I said, it has a feminine ending, but that ending, first of all, notice this is the son of David, not the daughter of David, and that feminine ending sometimes is used for occupational names. So he's not, this isn't given his actual name. He's called the preacher or the gatherer, the person who has gathered people together, but for a specific purpose, to hear a message, which is why we translated it here, the preacher. Some translations will just, instead of translating it, they'll just put the Hebrew word kohelet up there. And they'll say, you figure out what it means. We're not going to go there. I suppose that's all right as well. Now, that term kahal, from which this kohelet comes, um, 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 1, and also 2 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 2 speak about how Solomon assembled, the assembler, we could call it. He assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes. We also read in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 2, that all the men of Israel assembled themselves to King Solomon. Notice how this was used a number of times in context with Solomon. In 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 14, then the king faced about and blessed all the assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel, kahal is the term there, was standing. And then finally, in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 22, Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel. So a lot of references to the assembly in the presence of Solomon, which makes sense that this is the son of David speaking. So the author describes himself as the son of David. Now, David had a number of different sons, but only one son that actually became king, and the author is going to be described as one who has become king in Israel. However, already he's using what we could describe as a pen name. Instead of calling himself Solomon and just, making it very clear, instead he's calling himself Kohelet, the gatherer, the assembler, um, and he has sort of made it a pointed statement to describe himself in this way. And now he's going to speak when we get to verse 12 of how he was king over Jerusalem. So, son of David, king over Jerusalem. We sort of know who that is, even though he's been careful to avoid naming himself. And he will also refer to all those who ruled in Jerusalem before him. Now, that gives us pause, because David ruled in Jerusalem, and Solomon eventually ruled in Jerusalem. But to speak of all those who ruled, the only other people that ruled in Jerusalem before David and Solomon were the Canaanites, and these were pagan kings. Now, I'm not saying all of them were always pagan kings, because if I go back early enough to the days of Abraham, there was a king there by the name of Melchizedek that doesn't seem to have been a pagan king. He's described as a king, but also a priest of the Most High God. So maybe there was something way back then that was connected to God, and it made Jerusalem a special city. So we have the preacher, the assembler, we called him, and he's seen at the beginning. We're also going to see him at the end of the book in chapter 12, and we'll see him just mentioned briefly in the middle of the book. So he's going to be at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the book. And then there's Solomon, not named, but by insinuation, we see here, not mentioned by name, but his identity is insinuated. But there's going to be another, I don't know if I want to call it another character, but at least another name. And we have whoever it is that wrote the book. You say, well, isn't that the preacher? Well, maybe. However, when we get to chapter 12, we're going to see him speak of the preacher in the third person. Whoever's writing the book will speak of the preacher. And when you're writing, you usually say I instead of he. Now, that's not definitive. There were times, both, I suppose, in the modern world, but even in the ancient world, where there were writers that wrote of themselves in the third person. I think of Caesar's Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar. And everybody knew he was the author, and he wrote this book describing his adventures. But he describes himself in the book in the third person. He talks about how Julius Caesar did this, and Julius Caesar did that, instead of I did this and I did that. So maybe that's the same thing happening, or it's entirely possible that the book in its present final form had an author that is unnamed, while the preacher and Solomon are really perhaps describing the same person. Maybe. I'm not going to speak dogmatically here, because I wasn't there, and frankly, I don't know. Now, Dr. D. James Kennedy was one of I've had a number of mentors. He was one, I suppose. I first met him in 1985, and it was sort of interesting. We sat down and compared theological notes, and we're both surprised to find ourselves on the same page. But a number of years later, in fact, it wasn't all that long later, around that time, where he was preaching on an Easter Sunday morning, and he got up and he said, "I'm going to speak to you, but first of all, I want to let you know that there's something that's been said about me." And you didn't think it would get back to me, but it did. And it's been said that I denied the resurrection. Now, yeah, I remember I was sitting there in the church, and these three little old ladies were sitting beside me, and they went, "Oh my goodness!" And he said, and he went on. He says, "And the charge is true, but I ought to pause and introduce myself." And then he goes on to say, "And my name is Thomas." And he goes on to preach the rest of the sermon as though he were the Apostle Thomas in John chapter 20, who didn't believe in the resurrection when the other disciples told him. And he goes through and he explains that passage as if he's Thomas. He's asking, now everybody knew he's Dr. Kennedy. We all knew who he was, but he's asking us to assume he's speaking in the persona of Thomas. And some have thought maybe that as the writer slash speaker slash assembler, the Kohelet, is doing the same thing. And again, I don't want to say that that's the case because I'm not sure. But what I'm going to do, because he does ask us to assume that he is the son of David, the one who is reigning in Jerusalem, in other words, Solomon, I'm going to operate under that assumption. Right or wrong, I'm going to do the same thing that Dr. Kennedy asked us to do. I'm going to assume this is the person of Solomon. And so we come to verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, the Kohelet. And then he repeats it, vanity of vanities. And now a third time, this time he only says it once, all is vanity. Now that term here that is repeated, Havel, Havalim. Havel is, and notice you say, well, didn't you write Habel instead of Havel? In Hebrew, the B and the V are sort of interchangeable depending on you if you have a dagesh in the middle, little dot in the middle. So I think that's probably how you would be pronouncing it. Havel, Havalim, vanity of vanities. That word is the same name that we see way back in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 2, where Adam and Eve came together after they'd been tossed out of the Garden of Eden. And Eve becomes pregnant and she gives birth to, first to Cain, but now in verse 2 to his brother. And it's the same word, to, we say Abel, but Avel. And it's the same name. His name meant vanity, although it's been translated a few different ways. Job chapter 7 and verse 16 uses the same term, where Job says, leave me alone, for my days are but a vanity, but a vapor. And I think that's actually probably a little better of a translation. But it's the same term, same term. It can be rendered a few different ways. So vapor, avel. Also have Psalm chapter 39 and verse 5. Behold, you have made my days as handbreadths and my lifetime as nothing in your sight. Surely every man at his best is a mere breath. A breath, a vapor, a vel. Same idea here. And then finally, Proverbs chapter 31, verse 30. This is the proverb about the dynamic woman, the woman of valor, I like to call her. Charm is deceitful and beauty is, there it is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. So this term, avel, and it can refer to a vapor from your breath. For example, when you, now this doesn't happen down here where I live in Florida very often, but once in a while it will get very cold and the moisture and the weather is just right, and you walk outside your door and it's chilly out and you breathe out and from your mouth comes this little vapor. And it doesn't last. I mean, it goes out and within just a second or two, it has dissipated. That's the term that's being described, a vapor from your breath. But it can have three different ideas of what that is representing. So you can have where something is very little in the way of substance, it's sort of inconsequential. I mean, you breathe it out, boom, and then it's gone. Or it can describe something that is temporary, it's here today and gone, not even tomorrow, even today. It lasts, doesn't last a long time. Or it can describe something that is rather mysterious. You can't really grab a hold of it. It's an enigma. It's a mystery. And so the same term, avel, can have each one of those ideas. Which one is going to be used here in Ecclesiastes? And the answer is yes. I think we're going to see all three. So let's continue. Chapter 1, verse 3. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Notice you have man, and then you have the earth, and the point is that man isn't forever. He's here today and gone tomorrow, and he maybe has children, and then they're here today and they're gone day after tomorrow, and so it goes. But the earth, at least from our vantage point, now you say, well, the earth is gonna finally dissipate after so many 100,000 or billion years. He's not talking about that. He's talking generally. The earth is here, and we're not, and we go from generation to generation, and the earth continues. So it's talking about that which is temporal. Continue in verse 5. Also the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. It's like monotonous, blowing toward the south, then turning toward the toward the north. The wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses, the wind returns. The sun does its thing; it cycles. The wind does its things, and there's a certain monotony to the world, to life. The same old thing happens. Remember when I was a kid, one of my earliest chores was to mow the lawn. And let me just say, I wasn't particularly fond of mowing the lawn. Not that I didn't like work, it's just that you do it, and a couple weeks later, it had to be done again and again and again. And I hate doing things again, which is probably why I shouldn't be doing lawn work, because I'm the type of person to cut it in such a way that it won't grow anymore. That's not good either. Let me just say. Verse 7, all the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full to the place where the rivers flow. There they flow again, and it just keeps going and going. And again, there is a monotony to life. It's seen in the rivers, it's seen in the sun, it's seen in the wind. Verse 8, all things are wearisome. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not. So first you see all things, and then the eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. Um, the eye sees, and then it wants to see some more. The ear hears, and now it wants to hear some more. There's just this monotony that continues on and on and on. Verse 9, that which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. So there's nothing new under the sun. And that's one of the points that is going to start off the book of Ecclesiastes, this idea of how life is the same old, same old. It just continues to happen. In fact, verse 10 asks this sort of rhetorical question: is there anything of which one might say, see, this is new? Not really. See, already as it existed for ages which were before us. And so there's nothing new under the sun. Maybe it comes up again with a different name, but even names get repeated. Even names get repeated. And so, is there anything of which one might say, "See, this is new"? No. The answer is no. Verse 11: there is no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. So it's not just that there's nothing new. That which does take place is soon forgotten. I ask my students oftentimes, how many of you know the names of and they usually know the names of of course, obviously their parents, their grandparents, but I ask them, how about your great grandparents or your great great grandparents? And very oftentimes, they don't even know the name. Already those past generations have been forgotten. So here again, there's no remembrance of earlier things, also of the later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. If you have children and then grandchildren and great grandchildren and then great great, you're going to be forgotten. It's just going to happen. Get used to it. So there is no remembrance of these things. There will be no remembrance. There is none. There will be none. You're part of a long line of forgotten people. So that is our opening prologue, verses 1 through 11. Now, a prologue sort of sets the stage and gets things rolling. And we see here that, the preacher was introduced, that life is empty, and there's a monotony to life. When we get to the end of the book, that's going to be in chapter 12, we'll have a closing epilogue. Again, just a handful of verses. Again, we'll have a reference to the preacher. Again, we'll be told that all is emptiness, that all is avel, a vapor. And we will told not just that there's a monotony to life, I think that will be the idea, but that books are tiresome. And that's quite an interesting thing to say at the end of a book, because you've read this far, if you're still reading this, and frankly, you might be getting a little tired of it. And so the preacher is mentioned in the beginning, he's mentioned in the end. That's going to be the conclusion. And we will see him mentioned one time in chapter 7 in the middle. So from beginning to end to middle, the preacher has this message for us. Now, we're going to divide up this book into 5 sermons. And the first sermon hasn't really gotten started yet, although we've seen sort of an introduction in the prologue. It's going to tell Solomon's story. We haven't seen his story yet, but it's coming. This was the introduction to it. And in that introduction, not just the part we read, but the part that we will see in the first story is going to introduce to us four themes. Four themes. That there's a monotony to life. We already saw that theme. It was introduced in the epilogue, in the prologue. Next, that there's an emptiness to wisdom, and we'll see Solomon looking for wisdom, and he's going to find it and say, well, big deal on that. Next, that there is a futility and wealth, that there is a certainty of death. Notice those four themes, and then he will close with the observation that all of life is emptiness, but man ought to enjoy goodness because it's from God. God's going to be mentioned at the end of the first sermon. In fact, God is going to be mentioned at the end of all five of these sermons. And what we had in the first sermon, we haven't read it yet. We're going to come back next time and look at this first sermon. We're going to see the introduction to these four themes. There's a monotony to life. There's an emptiness to wisdom. There's a futility in wealth. There's a certainty of death. And then what's going to happen? Then what's going to happen is, starting with chapter 3, that we'll talk about the seasons of life, we're going to start seeing each one of those themes. In the third sermon, we're going to see that there's a monotony to life. And so one of those themes will be the big idea. And at the end of that sermon, we'll see this prophet and seeing God as the giver of all the seasons of life. God's going to be mentioned at the end. And then this will we'll come now to the third sermon, chapters 4 through 6. And in the third sermon, we're going to see the journey of life, about how there's an emptiness in wisdom. That was one of those four themes. And at the end of that section, we're going to be told that instead of being fearful in our journey, to enjoy life while it lasts, because it's a gift from God. And then we'll see the fourth sermon. He's going to ask the question, what do you want in life? And people sometimes want money, or they want power. And we're going to point out that there's a futility in wealth. Notice I threw in power as well, in wealth and power. And at the end of the sermon, we're going to see that man sees life as a struggle, but God gave life to be enjoyed. So live in a wise way. Enjoy what you have. Enjoy the time that you have. Don't worry about trying to get money or power. Those are slippery things. And then the fifth sermon, it talks about investing your life actually early in, but as you come to the end of the fifth sermon, you're coming to the end of your life, and it points out there's a certainty of death. So all four of these themes, and even in the certainty of death, because of the brevity of this life, we're told that man ought to fear the Lord and to follow his word. So that's where we're headed in the book of Ecclesiastes. Buckle up, you're in for a journey.